Hello, my friends. I've just gotten back from Russia, and I want to give you my read on what's happening right now, both on Ukraine and on the other flashpoints. Washington is stirring up. I'm going to walk through the same points that were discussed, but in one continuous, clear line so you can follow the logic. First, about this so-called 28-point plan being floated by the Trump administration. I've seen the list that's circulating. The Kremlin and the Russian Foreign Ministry have both said publicly they have received no official document from the U.S. So whatever's out there right now is either a leak, a trial balloon, or someone's attempt to sabotage the process. If the leaked 28 points are the actual U.S. proposal, then let me be blunt. It's dead on arrival from Russia's standpoint. Here's why. A key example is the military cap. The plan talks about capping Ukraine's army at 600,000. That's insane. If you remember Istanbul 2022, Russia and Ukraine were tentatively aligned around something like 85,000. Ukraine's active force at the start of the war was around 270,000. So in what world does Washington think Russia will agree to nearly triple the Ukrainian military? Russia's objective is demilitarization. Not demilitarization, but also a giant NATO-trained army next door. That's a non-starter. Same problem on territory. The plan says recognition of Crimea and 4 oblasts, but Russia has forces frozen in place in Kherson and Zaporizhia, and they're winning. They're not going to freeze a war while holding partial regions and then hand negotiating leverage away when momentum is theirs. Then there are points that reflect pure American delusion. One of them says Russia will be reintegrated into the global economy, sanctions lifted gradually, Russia invited back to the G8, etc. Russia doesn't care. BRICS already represents a larger share of global GDP growth than the G7, and Moscow has built around sanctions for years. Another point suggests Russian frozen assets would finance reconstruction in Ukraine like Russia is supposed to clap while its stolen money rebuilds the very state killing Russian soldiers. Not happening. So, yes, there's thinking in the document. It's not a lazy sophomore memo, but it's written from a U.S. fantasy frame that Russia needs Western approval, that Ukraine stays big and armed, and that Washington retains control over the post-war order. Russia won't sign up for any of that. Now, that doesn't mean diplomacy is impossible. The Russians like specificity. They'd rather receive a concrete list and tear it apart item by item than deal with vague slogans. So if a formal document arrives, Moscow will probably respond politely, "Interesting proposal, we're reviewing it." Then they'll explain what won't fly. But here's the bigger truth. This war is not ending with some symmetrical compromise. It ends when Ukraine can't fight anymore, and right now the Ukrainian defensive line is collapsing. Russia is breaking into Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhia. During any 6-month negotiation window, Russia will keep accelerating on the ground. If they secure the east bank of the Dnipro down from Kyiv, they strangle Ukraine economically. At that point, Kyiv either deals or it dies. Next, why publish these points publicly at all? Because this is the American style now. Leaks is negotiation tactics. We don't do tight closed-door diplomacy anymore. We float maximalist positions through media and X, then try to walk them back later as if that earns leverage. It's incompetent. In real negotiations, you don't light up the table before the other side even arrives. It almost always rebounds against us. And the Trump team adds its own flavor. They confuse diplomacy with real estate bargaining. Start high, posture loud, hope the other guy caves. But Russia isn't a bankrupt casino partner. Russia is on the battlefield winning. Now here's the critical poison pill for any future deal. The neo-Nazi extremist battalions inside Ukraine. You can elect whoever you want. You can remove Zelensky, swap faces, rebrand the government. The people who will violate any agreement are the ideological militants. They're not going to abate. Russia knows this from history. And if you want a model, look at Chechnya. The West tried funding and injecting insurgent fanaticism into Chechnya. Russia bled for years. then crushed it, then rebuilt society. Chechnya today is pro-Russian, stable, and modern compared to what outsiders expected. Russia has experienced destroying fanatic insurgencies and reconstituting a state. Ukraine could face the same logic: capture, kill, or neutralize the militant core, otherwise, no peace holds. Europe's position? They're stuck in sunk cost fallacy. They've poured money, weapons, credibility, and ideology into this war. And the higher the price, the harder it is for them to admit defeat. But they're constrained. No American Express black card. They're broke. Their industrial base can't keep up. They don't have weapons, stockpiles, and they don't have soldiers to spare. Ukraine itself is bleeding manpower at catastrophic rates. Between killed, wounded, and desertions, Ukraine is losing something like 60-80K troops per month while recruiting far less. That math ends only one way. So European leaders, Merz, Macron, Starmer, keep shouting, but their publics don't follow. Their approval ratings are collapsing. They can posture, but they can't sustain the war without Washington. Now, on the idea that Russia wants to separate broader U.S.-Russia relations from Ukraine, yes, Russia wants to talk security architecture, nuclear treaties. New START expires February 2026. Europe's framework, the whole big power stack separately from Ukraine. Ukraine is a theater inside a wider strategic war. Washington keeps trying to merge the two because domestic politics forces it. Trump wants to posture as peacebringer, but Democrats and anti-Russia hawks will attack him the second he normalizes ties. So even if Russia wants separation, U.S. politics keep collapsing the lanes back into one mess. Zelensky's position? Washington is done with him. Not necessarily openly, but practically. He's now an obstacle. Russia doesn't want him in a final deal. Parts of Washington don't want him either. If he stays, he complicates everything. The U.S. will look for a way to get him out of the way, elections pressure, or something uglier. That's the reality. Switching gears to Venezuela, what's happening off Venezuela's coast carrier groups, bombers, Tomahawk platforms, SOCOM rehearsals looks like pressure theater. Trump wants a win. He wants Maduro to cave or opposition gains he can sell domestically. But this show of force is backfiring. It pushes Venezuelans toward Maduro. The Washington-aligned opposition shrinks while nationalism grows. The worrying part isn't the carrier. It's the special operations machinery already operating in the shadows. SOCOM and CIA-style kinetic games are a recipe for an accident, escalation, or a humiliation. When you keep a large armed force cocked for months, something stupid eventually happens, just like passing around loaded guns in a classroom. And Venezuela is far more capable than people think. They have enough air defense to make U.S. naval forces pay if we go kinetic. So, again, the more likely endgame is not a grand invasion, but some face-saving diplomatic exit after Washington tries to extract concessions. On Israel, Zionist politics bleeding into everything. The meeting between Huckabee and Jonathan Pollard fits a pattern, trying to defang dissent inside the U.S. intelligence and military bureaucracy, especially any anti-Zionist or anti-war currents. Pollard is loyal to Israel above America. Huckabee is a hardcore Zionist, even though he's not Jewish. That ideological drive is splitting MAGA from establishment Republicans, and it's not going away. If Trump were smart, he'd cut ties with that faction before it eats his base alive. Finally, Iran's foreign minister is telling you the truth. They'll negotiate, but they won't accept dictation. They've reached draft frames multiple times with Witkoff, and every time Washington walks it back. Why? Because regime change ideology is still hard-coded into U.S. policy and Congress. People like Lindsey Graham and that whole cult won't rest until Tehran falls. That's been legislated in various forms for years. So even if the negotiators sketch a deal, the machine behind them kills it. Iran, Russia, and China are tightening cooperation. Iran learned from the 12-day war, upgraded missile posture, and is preparing for another strike. They believe an attack is coming. I believe an attack is coming too likely before Christmas 2025 unless something in Israeli domestic politics explodes first. Even if Netanyahu fell, the next guy would pursue the same line with a quieter tone. So we're staring at a potentially cataclysmic war in Southwest Asia, and that war would accelerate the empire's collapse far faster than Ukraine ever could. That's where things stand. The U.S. is trying to negotiate from fantasies while losing strategic ground. Russia is focused, methodical, and advancing. Europe is trapped in sunk cost. Ukraine's manpower and defenses are failing. Venezuela is mostly a pressure stunt that risks spiraling via covert ops. Iran is the next big ignition point unless Washington walks away from regime change insanity. That's my unified take, Larry C. Johnson, on what all of this means right now. We have some breaking news. We were already getting ready to do a show about this new 28-point peace plan that's circulating everywhere about what Russia will accept, what Ukraine will accept, and what the Europeans will accept. And then literally minutes before going on air, we get this statement from Volodymyr Zelensky that is openly defiant. He's calling out the President of the United States, not necessarily by name, but absolutely by position, a lack. So let's jump right into it. What Zelensky is saying right up front is that he's being pressured by the President of the United States and that there's a deadline coming up fast. According to sources I've just spoken to, that date is November 27th. That's barely a week away. So we're about to see very quickly how this pressure campaign is going to play out. Now, I want to make sense of this in the larger context because the pressure Zelensky is under isn't about Thanksgiving optics or wrapping this up by the holiday. The pressure is about reality collapsing at multiple levels at once. First, the battlefield. The defensive network of cities Ukraine has relied on is falling. And once those cities fall, what's behind them isn't another fortified belt, it's open ground all the way to the Dnipro. The same pattern is showing up in Zaporizhia. Key positions are suddenly dropping in a cascade. I've seen this before in other wars. Things go slow, 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 and then very fast. That's the psychological snap point. Morale breaks, structure breaks, and the front unravels. Second, politics inside Kyiv. Zelensky isn't just facing external pressure. His own political base is fracturing. His party, still dominant in parliament, is splitting, with a chunk drifting toward the opposition and demanding a unity government. They want his chief of staff, Yermak, removed. A number of top officials have already fled abroad, some to Israel, some elsewhere. So the political center is cracking as the military line cracks. Zelensky is being squeezed from both sides. That's why Trump's team thinks this is the moment to push. They see collapse and think they can force a settlement. But here's Putin's response to all this 28-point plan chatter. You see him on the front line in military uniform, something he almost never does. And he says, the Russian people require the special military operation to be completed. Their objective is not half measures, it's completion. In other words, demilitarization, denazification, neutrality, and removal of the root threats. That's the core message. Now, let's talk about the status of these 28 points, because that is absolutely crucial. The Russians are saying they haven't received anything officially. Maria Zakharova has stated they know nothing about this plan, and Dmitry Peskov has echoed the same line: no formal consultations, no U.S. proposal under consideration. So right now, this is not a negotiation document. It's a speculative paper floating in media space. And if that paper is really what Washington intends to submit, Russia will reject most of it. Why? Because it smells like a bait and switch. When you read it carefully, the central structure of the plan is about forcing a ceasefire, not a political settlement. And Moscow sees ceasefires as a trap. They've lived through Minsk. They are adamant no ceasefire that freezes the conflict so the West can rearm Ukraine and restart the war later. Putin keeps returning to the same anchor, the root causes. This war was never about shaving a little territory here or there. It was about NATO expansion, the threat vector from Ukraine, and Russia's demand for a new European security architecture that stops missiles from sitting minutes from Moscow. Put it in practical terms, missiles in Poland to 9 minutes to Moscow. Missiles in Romania to 7 missiles in Ukraine would cut the time to 3 minutes, too short to even determine if they're nuclear or conventional. Russia takes that existentially. That's why any proposal that doesn't lock neutrality and stop NATO push is meaningless to them. On top of that, the 4 oblasts and Crimea are constitutionally integrated into Russia after referendums. Even if Putin wanted to trade them away, he can't not without rewriting the Constitution. It's a red line. So the Russian view is simple. They're winning, and they don't negotiate away victory. Now look at Europe. Europe says Trump is giving Russia everything, while Russia says the plan doesn't even address its requirements. That contradiction alone tells you how broken the Western frame is. Europe's leadership is also openly signaling they won't follow Trump's plan. You've got EU officials saying any plan must have Europeans on board, insisting Russia must make concessions first, calling Russia the sole aggressor, same recycled script. But behind the rhetoric is a strategic aim. Europe wants the war to continue. They want a ceasefire only to rebuild Ukraine's army, retrain it, rearm it, and restart the conflict later. They admit this explicitly, and why are they doing it? Because European elites are desperate. They have no unifying project left except rally to Ukraine. Without that, Europe fractures. North versus South. Austerity versus debt. Old Europe versus new Europe. Industrial decline versus social unrest. Their economic model is dying. They lost cheap Russian pipeline gas. Energy prices in Europe are among the highest in the world. Manufacturing is collapsing. Real wages have stagnated or declined for decades. Populations are angry and alienated. So, yes, a normal relationship with Russia would solve a chunk of these problems, but Europe's system won't allow it. Parties or leaders who advocate normalization get crushed through scandals, legal bans, media campaigns, or political purges. That's why the cordon sanitaire exists, to keep any anti-NATO pro-normalization force from taking power. Europe is hollowing itself out to preserve elite control. Which brings me to the really disturbing strategic point. Europe can't fight Russia conventionally. Its armories are empty. Its manpower is absent. Its publics have no appetite for war. So why the constant war rhetoric? Because they want a Pearl Harbor-style incident to drag the United States into direct conflict. Not a million-man European invasion, something smaller like a Baltic flashpoint or cable incident that's escalated into a NATO crisis. The goal is to force America to do the heavy lifting. Here's the irony. America can't sustain a high-intensity conventional war with Russia either. Our industrial capacity can't replace losses at that tempo. Our stockpiles can't keep up. If it stayed conventional, we'd still take a beating early, and escalation risk would be enormous. So Europe's strategy is both reckless and immoral, provoking a war they can't fight, hoping America bleeds for them. Now, where does this all go if Russia says no, Europe says no, Ukraine says no? It goes to escalation. The West is psychologically incapable of accepting NATO's defeat by Russia on the battlefield. They can't imagine a world where the West isn't issuing the orders. So they keep inventing narratives about Russian weakness, huge Russian casualties, Russian collapse, things they don't believe, but need to believe for identity survival. Russia will respond the only way a state can when diplomacy becomes theater. They will finish the war militarily, not because they love conquest, but because security becomes impossible otherwise. Putin has already said it. Complete the operation, neutralize the threat, then build a political settlement from a position of strength. As a negotiator, I understand this pattern. When the gap is too wide and the other side won't accept reality, there is a trial of strength first, then negotiation after the outcome is clear. That's where we are. And I'm saying this on the record plainly, because later nobody should be allowed to pretend we didn't see it coming. We did. The evidence is already lining up. The rhetoric from Kyiv and Brussels is detached from reality. And the longer they cling to fantasy, the worse the final outcome will be for Ukraine and for Europe itself.